Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist. On today's show, we're talking to Jamie Pye, the editor of Northern Slant. Jamie is a researcher at Queen's University, and he has been doing some work looking at a citizens' assembly and how that would work in Northern Ireland. Essentially, he believes that this could be a really interesting and potentially problem-solving way for Northern Ireland to deal with the vast number of issues that the politicians in the country seem unable to deal with. The Irish Language Act, same-sex marriage, the list goes on. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to like and subscribe to us on iTunes, on YouTube, on Facebook, Twitter, and don't forget to share the show with everybody. You can email it to people, you could write down the name of it and throw it in a paper ball across the office. However you want to let people know that you're listening to this podcast. Anyway, let's get on with it. Here's Jamie Pye. So, Jamie, thanks for appearing on the show. Lovely to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. I saw your video on the Citizens Assembly, and I was keen to quiz you on, how you thought it would work and everything that it entails. Why don't we start with Northern Slant? So, how did that begin? What was the kind of thinking? Why did you guys feel that Northern Ireland needed a rival to the Belfast Telegraph?
Well, thanks for having me on again, Josh. So Northern Slant started a few years ago, back in my undergraduate university days, whenever a good friend of mine, Connor Daly, who had been editor at the Gown, the student newspaper, was interested in doing something for fresh bloggers to be able to share their perspectives, their views on current affairs and lifestyle and leisure in Northern Ireland. So that's really where it started. It was Connor's initiative just to get something fresh and different. So we're not exactly a rival to the Belfast Telegraph. We're not get ahead of ourselves. but what you could say would be a supplement. So the Belfast Telegraph is there. It's got its purpose. It's got its audience. But we think of ourselves as doing something a bit different. For a start, we're not just about covering the news. That's something that we're very conscious about. We're not just reporting on what's happening. Our purpose, as we see it, is to try and give a bit of analysis, a bit of perspective on what's going on. Because with Northern Ireland politics, for somewhere that's got this history of division, it's had this very troubled recent past, there's a sense of urgency really about breaking a cycle of pessimism, because that can be all around and it can be very difficult to get out of that vicious circle. So what we want to do is try to offer a diverse range of perspectives, but to do so in as constructive a way as possible. We have this shared spot of land called Northern Ireland, or whatever other people want to call it. But it's there nonetheless, and the people are there nonetheless. So we have to try and figure a way out of sharing that space together. Whatever people's political views are, whatever people's constitutional preferences are, we want to be able to provide a platform for people to have constructive views and perspectives on how we can move Northern Ireland forward and progress.
Progress is a great word. We've to be fair, we've seen a lot of it from where we were in 1998, even within our lifetimes, to go from somewhere where you didn't believe honestly that, or a lot of people maybe didn't believe honestly that there was any chance of ever getting government back to Northern Ireland, to a place where we had 10 years pretty much of uninterrupted actual things going on at Storm and people agreeing to work together, which was fantastic, and until some people put some wood pellets in a boiler and everything came crumbling down. And we're kind of now at a point where we're waiting. I feel like we're just kind of on hold while I feel that once Storm it gets back up and running in whatever form it ends up getting to, if at all, that things might just end up sort of carrying on as they were before. It'll just sort of fall back into place. Everyone just sort of jumps back into an old life. But you guys had, and I saw your video particularly of the Citizens Assembly that I mentioned there before. I was keen to get you to kind of lay out how you thought it would work, what sort of like qualifications you would ask for people to be a part of it. Would there be any? Would it be trying to get like the most representative demographic like view of Northern Ireland and putting them all in a room, or are you going for like certain levels of understanding of like the conflict and the sort of political systems and the way they work, or is that not really a bother to you? Give me the big picture.
I'll do my best, Josh. So as a bit of a disclaimer, I should probably say as well, I mean, my day job is doing research at Queen's University. So at the moment I'm doing a PhD whereby my topic is looking at how a citizens' assembly might work in Northern Ireland. That's my job remit, really, to explore this, to see whether or not this kind of thing could be a legitimate way of making decisions in a place where it's quite hard to make decisions at the best of times.
Yeah.
So that's really where my own interest in the idea came from. So I started the project quite skeptical, actually. I thought it sounded like an interesting and different kind of thing to be looking at. It's not just looking at the general question of, what can we do to reform Northern Ireland politics, very broadly. It was quite a narrow and novel idea. So looking at the question of legitimacy, I was quite skeptical at the beginning. What would people think of this wild and wacky idea that isn't really going to be familiar to most people? But the more I've studied it and the more I've looked at data on people's perceptions of what this would entail, the more sort of encouraged I've been, and the more I've personally come around to the idea that this is actually a viable and practical thing. So in terms of who would be involved, to me, the single nicest thing about the idea of a citizens' assembly is that when you're looking at who is gathered, it's essentially a cross-section of the population. So randomly selected to produce a representative sample of the whole population. So in so many ways, it's beautiful, that automatically you get this neat mirror of society that can be gathered in one place. So that's the best advantage, because elections, they have their place. They have like a traditional, conventional sense of legitimacy that we know that's part of democracy. That's how we understand democracy in so many different countries. But elections have their pitfalls. Most people in the population aren't strongly political in that, they don't have really strong attachments to political parties. Elections require that. Whereas a citizens' assembly can get a cross-section of society in a different way. So it can get a sample of views in a different way to those purely gathered through elections and through the competitive and maybe quite aggressive, campaign around an election, and maybe express the views that are out there, represent them, but do so in a less confrontational, less competitive environment. So that's the core pitch, if you like.
So what often gets me is the fact that it's about 50 to 60% of Northern Ireland will vote Sinn Féin or DUP. But I have a theory that if you went down onto the streets of Belfast or Derry or Ballymena or Newry, anywhere, that I think you would be hard pressed to find a single person who feels like the MLAs are earning their keep right now, that they should like be allowed to be on full pay and not be like governing. Mm-hmm. Like my mom is endlessly furious about it. She's a nurse, so she's like gone through like pay cap after pay cap after pay cap. So, and she just, if I wasn't in work, I wouldn't get paid. Like, it's outrageous that they've been not doing anything for 11 months. And I normally have to be like, well, they're kind of doing something technically. They're doing like constituency work but like I just feel like it's a bit. I don't know how they get the respect back of people. And not that I feel that they had the respect of all the people in the first place, but I feel like I've been looking for essentially like a way to give Stormont like an air of legitimacy that I just feel it's kind of lost. And the Citizens Assembly is definitely like an interesting way of doing it. So I'm assuming you've looked at the way they used it down south. Do you maybe like is there things you'd like to mirror from the way they did it? Is there a way that, or is there like other examples around the world that you'd sort of take cues from, or where do you get your inspiration for how it would work?
Well, the encouraging thing is that there are practical examples of this thing being in practice. So it's not that this would be a completely original idea. And in fact, like if you go way back to how democracy started, I mean, this was democracy in its purest form in ancient Greece, where it wasn't about elections. It was about getting a representative random sample of ordinary citizens to be the decision makers, to be the politicians, if you like. And they held that office for like a year, and then it rotated by law. So it's a very pure form of democracy. But yeah, it has actually been in practice in recent years all over the world. So down south in Dublin at the minute, there is the Irish Citizens Assembly. So there you have 100 randomly selected ordinary citizens that mirrors the Irish population. So they've been given the remit by the Irish government of looking at different political issues, one of them being, of course, the Eighth Amendment and abortion. So along with other things like, on climate change and things like that, so those ones haven't been getting as much media attention because they're not as contentious. But I suppose the key thing is, the context is really important. In Ireland, there is the issue of abortion. It is a contentious issue, and the government on its own didn't want to take a position directly on that contentious issue. It wanted to delegate it somehow to somewhere else. So in that case, this is what the Citizens Assembly is for. So it's tasked with finding a common ground, a way forward on a very hot topic issue in the context of Ireland at the minute. And another thing beyond that representative sample, the next important feature of a Citizens Assembly is that it's not just like a poll where, in that you have a representative sample and people are asked for their opinions on a political issue. In a poll, people are just put on the spot, basically, what do you think? And then most of the time people just pluck something out off the top of their head because, why would you expect people to have really deep political positions on a lot of complex issues? But the whole point of a Citizens Assembly then is that there is then a deliberation element whereby the Citizens Assembly gets a range of arguments, presentations from experts on both sides of whatever the issue is, to give people information, give people a bit of a background to the issue at stake, and then to be familiar with the pros and cons of whatever the proposed way forward is. And then people are asked to talk and reflect and ask questions from the experts. So it's that deliberation element plus it being a representative sample of the population that can be a really powerful claim to the legitimacy of whatever decision they take, because it's saying that if the whole population were gathered, this is what the whole population would agree if they were able to have access to all of the information and to perform all of this deliberation over all of this time. Because the reality is, for most people are busy. They are interested a bit in politics. They care about the stakes of politics, but rationally, it doesn't make sense for people to have, read detailed, reports and, have a really in-depth understanding of whatever a hot button issue is. So that's the really important benefit of having a citizen assembly that can deliberate, because that's what its task is to do.
So what is the where does it draw its authority from? Like, what would you need for people to say, yeah, okay, we're going to have a citizens' assembly? Like, whose approval would you need? Downing Street, or would you need Stormont, or could you just like declare mob rule at up at Stormont, with jam the gates shut and flag on the roof and.
Well, there could certainly be different levels of radicalism.
Yeah.
I mean, usually when they've been done and done well, it's been where the Citizens' Assembly has been set up by the government. So that's been the case in the South, where the government explicitly has, legally established the Citizens' Assembly. It then passes its report to Parliament, and then there should be a referendum penciled in on the recommendation of the Citizens' Assembly. So it has, it's got buy-in, and it's got official standing. That was the case in Canada as well, in a couple of provinces where they had citizens' assemblies on electoral reform. So those were issues where there were some weird election results in a couple of Canadian provinces, and the government then felt that it wasn't in the best position to recommend a constitutional change on the electoral system. So they delegated the issues to a citizens' assembly, and then referendums were held on the recommendation. So those both had official standing as well. In Northern Ireland, I suppose, it's very uncertain, obviously, what the nature of government is at the minute. But there are different ways that this could work, because, I think the idea of seeing it as an alternative to Stormont is probably, an exaggeration, and probably not helpful. But it could, be best seen as a form of help that the politicians could tap into, given where we're at and given the inability to make any progress in the conventional ways. So we've seen that an election doesn't really resolve anything. It just sort of hardens people's opinions and polarizes the parties and the public further. There may be direct rule coming down the line. All of the parties have said, that that's not their number one preference. So if direct rule happens, by definition, then it's, everyone's a loser kind of thing, because, nobody's getting really what they want. And we've seen that the talks themselves haven't worked. Whenever the parties have had, effectively 11 months to discuss the issues.
Yeah.
So they've tried, and that's fair enough. They've had a chance, but realistically, is there going to be any more progress? If they talk further, maybe, but maybe the parties need something else to make the decision for them. Maybe they need a different way out, other than just ratcheting up the stakes higher and higher as the talks keep continuing. So it could be very rational for the politicians to say, okay, we would like to set up a citizens' assembly on issue X, whatever the divisive issue might be, and we will accept this as the decision to implement, to be able to actually govern this place. Because that's the issue, really. You mentioned your mum as a nurse, affected by the reality of, the lack of a government. So it's about saying that if the parties can agree to govern on the important issues that aren't make or break issues in terms of forming a government, then let them get to that stage, rather than holding up the process of governing by these hot button, really thorny issues that the parties find so difficult amongst themselves.
I often think of it somewhat like just the way a Tarantino film ratchets up to everyone pointing a gun at each other.
Yeah.
He's got Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill and shotguns each and sort of pointing at each other's heads. But
let's hope not.
Hopefully not. But anyway, what issues would you have the Citizens' Assembly look at? Do you have any in mind? Would you start with, say, right, Citizens' Assembly deal with the Irish Language Act? That's causing too much. That's causing serious impasse, and maybe hold, I don't know, citizens court or whatever. I don't know what you would do about RHI, just give it to someone else. To the amount of conflicts of interest going on with the refusal to step down or investigate yourselves is just an absurd. It's just an absurd level of conflict of interest. Like, all the other parties should be like, and I think they pretty much are, being like, look, we want an investigation, and the DUP are like, well, maybe, and you just like, there's no way that you can like legitimately expect the DUP to investigate themselves openly and honestly. Like, that's just not going to happen. Like, they won't even tell us where that £435,000 came from the Constitutional Research Council that they spent on Brexit on the mainland, just for the secrecy laws, and they know who the money came from. They just won't tell us. Like, you expect them to investigate their own leader? Anyway, yeah. What issues do you think they would have to deal with? Like, if you got like a long list of things that you think that they should be put to them, or?
Well, for me personally, I mean, I don't really mind what the list is. It's whatever, the issues are that are causing the issue of gridlock in the first place, what's causing the impasse. So, like, in the media, I mean, it's widely reported that Irish language legislation is a big sticking point. And we've seen, both Sinn Féin and the DUP and the other parties too, taking quite strong positions on that. So it might, on that kind of issue, be difficult to see how, the politicians themselves will be able to get over their existing positions. So to give you a bit of maybe a flavour of some of the research that's been going on at Queen's, what we did was we created an experiment around the issue of Irish language legislation. So we had, along with my supervisor, John Gary, and some other co-authors, we got a representative sample of 2,000 people.
Is that John Gary, the politics lecturer?
He is a politics lecturer, not John Barry now.
John Gary. Okay, yeah, I'm mixing the two up. Okay.
There's John Barry and John Gary, both politics lecturers, just to be confusing. But yeah, so with John Gary, in our experiment, what we did was we had a representative sample of 2,000 people. They were all given a decision on the Irish language that they didn't like. So at the start of the interview, they were asked, what their own position was, whether they supported an Irish Language Act or whether they opposed an Irish Language Act. So everyone who supported one were told that an Irish Language Act wasn't to be introduced, and vice versa. And then what we did to make an experiment, we randomly assigned those people to different groups. So some people would be told that the decision was taken by a referendum. Some people were told that the decision was taken by the British government under direct rule. Some people were told it was taken after party talks or in the conventional way. And then some people were told that the decision was taken by a citizens' assembly. So the really striking thing was that across the board, when we asked people whether they would accept the decision, so this is a decision that they don't like upwards of 70% of people said they would accept the decision across the board. But interestingly, the differences between the groups weren't really very big at all. So for those who were told it was taken by a citizens' assembly, compared to direct rule or inter-party talks, the levels of acceptance were exactly the same. So in other words, it doesn't make a difference if it's taken by a citizens' assembly or by elected politicians themselves. People are just as likely to accept an unacceptable decision that they don't like. So that's an interesting way of looking at a contentious issue like the Irish language, and specifically policy over the Irish language. How can you deal with it? Surely people are, very, very polarised on it. But at the end of the day, a lot of people probably will be upset by whatever a final decision is on it. And so it's an interesting test of legitimacy then, that the mechanism of a citizens' assembly isn't viewed by people as being illegitimate, at least compared to the conventional methods that are out there already. But then to repeat, like the other advantages of a citizens' assembly, I mean, it might have a better chance of actually being able to rationally and calmly deliberate on the arguments for and against in the first place, in a way that politicians don't have that same space to be able to really channel the sound arguments. So I'm not wedded to any particular issue as being one that could be considered by a citizens' assembly, but it's publicly on the record that Irish language is a divisive one. But there are other issues too that could be, considered by a citizens' assembly too. I mean, we
have a laundry list.
Yeah, I mean, whatever the divisive issues are that politicians themselves are unwilling or unable to reach agreement on, those could be the ones that could be delegated, if you like, to the citizens' assembly. And the politicians, at the end of it, they could still have the power to say, no, we don't accept this result. But it would be quite a tough, position to say no to effectively the will of the people after, this.
Sorry, I can't.
No,
that phrase has been ruined for me.
I know the will of the people. It is a horrible phrase anyway. It's so vague what it actually means. But arguably, this is actually a very good way of finding out, what that collective will is. After hearing the evidence, what would a representative sample of the population think if they knew the ins and outs of a particular issue?
That's a really profound set of results that you got. That, like on a couple of different levels, and maybe I'm reading into it way too much, but
no, please do.
It's what I like to do.
Good.
So the levels of acceptance of a decision were 70% or in and around, like pretty much equivalent to that for a citizens' assembly, for a Stormont decision, and for a decision imposed by direct rule. So they were happy with. So people were equally accepting of all three of those.
Yeah. Now, so I didn't mention the referendum because that was a surprising result, actually. So compared to those other ones that I mentioned, the level of acceptance was the same for citizens' assembly. For a referendum, the level of acceptance was over 90%, which is pretty intriguing. So. Because we sort of thought that before the experiment in Northern Ireland, particularly somewhere where a majority voted Remain in the Brexit referendum, and yet, didn't get the result they wanted, there still seems to be something about a referendum as a decision-making tool that seems like extra legitimate for a lot of people. So it is an interesting idea then that perhaps there could be like a sequence here. Maybe a citizens' assembly can be a good tool to rationally sound out the arguments, and for the representative group of people to come up with their recommendation, and then maybe their recommendation then does need to go to a referendum to get like a final layer of legitimacy, especially for those who have the strongest opinions, because that's what we found with the referendum group, that for all the other conditions, most people, were accepting of the decision, but it was usually those who had the strongest views who were least accepting, as you'd expect. If you have the strongest view on an Irish language policy, for example, and you don't get what you want, then you're probably going to be least accepting of the decision. It makes sense.
Yeah.
Whereas for them, when it was taken by a referendum, even those individuals were far more likely to accept the decision as those who were more moderate about the issue in the first place, which is most people. So that could be an interesting way of being able to get moderate voices represented in the first place, because there are a lot of them in Northern Ireland, and they don't traditionally get the hearing that they deserve according to their number in the population. But then maybe a referendum could be a good way of being able to have a higher level of acceptance across those who have stronger positions on whatever the issue is. So it's an interesting kind of like set of findings there.
Yeah, well, so I assume that when we're talking about the extreme views not being the ones that get the people who hold extreme views not being the ones who take or are as accepting of those sort of results, is that it's going to be sort of probably not, maybe not exactly, but 15% of each end of whatever issue. It's not going to be like a 30% block somewhere and then 70%.
Yeah.
So it means that like, you've still got like that big 70% in the middle.
Yeah.
Accepting sort of thing. And that, I'm not sure what that says either about people's respect for Stormont and Westminster.
Yeah.
Or whether that means that they just think that the citizens are far more capable than maybe you assume people would think the citizens are capable of. Because I think is it an FDR quote that I love, and it's like the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with your average voter, which always gets me because it's a little bit true. Like when you see some of the people that the BBC News managed to find to interview on the street, I just like, where do you find these people? Or like, how have you edited them to make them just look mad? Or maybe they're just after the clicks, like the shares. But we were talking about that woman who was on Channel 4. You saw the memes of the woman who thought that the Irish were just bitter because they lost.
Yeah.
I'll try and find that video and put it in the description for anyone who hasn't seen it. It's outstanding. But do you think that 90% acceptance of a referendum result indicates that if Northern Ireland was given the option to be a separate entity to the rest of the UK in like a special case, that they would be willing to do that because they would say, okay, well, 56% of us voted to remain. Like maybe we should be looking at a situation where, you know, we get that sort of arrangement where Northern Ireland is like an exception. It's like an asterisk in the EU rule book. Like there's loads of them. Like there's no like the EU is fucking complicated. I like to joke that the Brexit vote like wiped out about a third of my degree because I did so many different European law classes. But not that I'm bitter, but
no, not at all.
But do you think that sort of indicates that we would accept a different relationship for Northern Ireland, or do you think that suggests that people will just are more accepting of the wider United Kingdom wide result, and that they're happy to leave because of that, and they just sort of, not to trot out a Brexiteer's phrase, but get on with it essentially?
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of different things going on at once, really, with this like referendum result in our experiment. I mean, I think one thing that's important to note is that this experiment was just about one issue, and that was like a decision on an Irish Language Act. So it was people's acceptance levels for that specific contentious issue. It could be different depending on what the question is. So if the question was, you know, if there is a referendum and the decision was taken by a majority vote to leave the UK and join a united Ireland, or, you know, something to that effect, or, you know, to remain in the UK and not to join the Republic of Ireland, that might provoke, you know, that might have more people with more closely held views. Let's say, you know, people may have more fundamental perspectives on that, because it is more of a constitutional question rather than just a policy question. Important as policy questions are, there's something maybe about constitutional issues that gets people maybe a bit more worked up about the issue, and because there is more at stake. So that could be a factor, because like there is other survey evidence out there from the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey that's asked every year. For some years, when the question's been asked, you know, if there was a united Ireland, you know, in your lifetime, could you, you know, to what extent would you accept the decision? So with that question, there is still a sizable minority who, say what they would find it impossible to accept. So that figure is quite consistent. It hasn't really gone away. And in fact, this year, perhaps, the results will show that it's increased. You never know, just because things have become a bit more polarized in recent months.
Well, I know people our age who like 20, 25, who would just, I think, anyway, or I know some of them for a fact at least, would very, very, very seriously consider leaving the country if we became part of Ireland. And I don't think it's like fundamentally like a constitutional question or like an identity question. That I think a lot of them just, like things like the NHS and stuff and the amount of money we get from the UK and like the fact that, that just Northern Ireland financially would probably be worse off for at least a couple of years. Like you don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. Like obviously it's all incredibly speculative, but they're like, well, look, I think I would probably leave. I'd probably go to Scotland. We share that kindred Remain spirit.
So that is one legitimate way in which people might respond to a decision that they personally don't like. Just as with the Brexit result for itself, that's already influenced where people live and where they maybe accept job offers and things like that, or where they apply for jobs in the first place. There are definitely different ways then of expressing not liking the decision, when it is like constitutional. So it's an interesting question. And there is other stuff then as well, more recently, that John Gary and John Coakley have done at Queen's, which is looking at the different possible post-Brexit borders for Northern Ireland. One of the striking things from one of their recent surveys was that if, for example, the border was drawn down the Irish Sea, whereby Northern Ireland had special status and remained in the customs union and single market, and the rest of the UK didn't, then a lot of unionists would still say they accept the decision and they could live with it. But again, like you've got about 40% of that in that particular case who say they wouldn't be able to accept the decision. So yes, it's a majority of unionists who might be able to accept this special status arrangement, but like 40% is still a big minority. When you consider maybe how strong some of the views within that minority might be. So the issue of acceptance and non-acceptance of decisions when they're really contentious, it can be tricky to understand what that means, the different levels of intensity of those opinions.
Well, you'd maybe get, instead of a brain drain, you get a Brit drain, but well, that brings you touched on the border there, and that was definitely something I wanted to ask you about, because right, so for anyone that is listening and doesn't like fully appreciate or quite get like why the Irish border is contentious and why there's like so much, I don't know what the word you use, hoo-ha or just hot air being spoken about it, is because so right now the British government has this, and the DUP, and have this magical position where the British government wants a hard border with Calais, right? But at the same time, they want a frictionless, no border in Ireland, no border in the Irish Sea, and they're also in government with the DUP who don't want a different relationship for Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK. They want the same relationship. So they have to walk this area where they have a hard border in Calais. We're out of the customs union, out of the single market, but at the same time, that border is there's no checks, or there's no like real checks at the border, and they can't have both, because the four freedoms of the EU are indivisible. So you have the freedom of movement of goods, services, people, and capital, and those four come together. So if you have a hard border for immigration, you have a hard border for everything else. Regardless of whether you have a free trade agreement with them, that just means it's easier. That just means that there's slightly less checks. There's still some checks. And no one seems to admit that if they want their hard Brexit, which they're pushing for, and I don't agree with it, but, like, government is government. You just sort of got to let things go the way they're going to go. Voice your opinion and then, see what happens. But they don't seem to want to admit that the hard border is far more likely than anyone is talking about. Mm-hmm. And if there's a no deal and we crash out of the EU in 2019 with no agreement, there will be a very hard border that has to go up. And the only way in which there is no border is that we stay in the single market. And no one seems willing to admit that. So why do you think that is? What way do you see it going? And, what sort of arrangement do you see us kind of ending up with, if any?
Wow, I know. Well, I'll start with the last bit first. I mean, because the simple answer to that is I haven't a clue. I mean, it's so hard to predict, where all of this is going. What is easier to look at is, the trajectory so far, and that has been exactly like you say. We know what the logical end point is. The logical end point is that if the whole of the UK is outside of the single market and outside of the customs union, then there will be a border that needs to be enforced, because there you have an arrangement where you've got one set of trade rules in one territory and another set in another. So at the intersection of those different sets of rules, you have to have something to control the difference, or at least regulate or monitor whatever. So that's like the logical endpoint. And I mean, we've known that for some time, because the British government has said, very early on that it didn't want a hard border. In fact, it went further. It said there will be no hard border. There will be no return to the borders of the past. And so it wasn't, just an aspiration. You should be able to read that as, its position. And then at the same time, you have, this commitment to very early on to leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. So to be honest, I think, the reasons for that seemed to be at the time that Theresa May probably wanted to establish herself and assert her authority within her own party, as a prime minister who took office in the midst of the referendum chaos, if you like, with David Cameron resigning, as a Remain campaigner. She probably felt that she needed to establish her credentials with a lot of the backbench rebels in her own party who'd pushed for the referendum. So promising to leave the single market and customs union probably seemed like a way of being able to do that very effectively, to say, leaving the EU means all of this. Even though, it has to be said, during the campaign itself, you had so many Leave campaigners saying that we could be the next Norway, we could be the next Switzerland, they can survive perfectly fine but outside the EU. They have strong economies outside of the EU. But of course, they still have to accept so much of the
sovereign wealth fund in several Scandinavian countries that has been it was worth hundreds of billions in some cases.
Yeah, so they have their own unique circumstances, just as Britain does have its own unique circumstances. Let's admit that as well. But the reality is that Switzerland, Norway, they still have to accept the vast majority of the rules without actually having a say in how the rules are made in the first place. That's because they've chosen to be outside of the EU, but yet they've also recognised that they don't gain sovereignty by being completely isolated. That they don't gain control by not having the same sets or broadly the same sets of customs rules and everything to prevent seriously hard borders that would undermine trade with their closest neighbours. So I think what we're seeing now is a bit of a reality check in two ways. First of all, that taking back control, it was a really fantastic slogan because it was so effective, as a very catchy and very emotionally charged campaign slogan to get people behind a very simple message, and they did. But taking back control, as was pointed out at the time, a lot, doesn't necessarily mean that, you can do that by just leaving the likes of the EU. That doesn't mean that you can somehow just get back all of that sovereignty, because the world just doesn't operate like that. So I think there's a bit of a reality check in that sense. And then also for, the Northern Ireland parties themselves, when we go to our level, because we had during the campaign that interesting position where the DUP eventually came out against Brexit, or in favour of Brexit against membership of the EU. And I suppose, that was a very much an ideological position because, they'd been a Eurosceptic party, since its inception, so that was no surprise. But I honestly don't personally think that it ever expected that it would end up with a Brexit result. They actually have to implement and be involved in finding ways to make it work for Northern Ireland itself, and with the unique circumstances of the border there. So it's a bizarre, just combination of circumstances, really, that taken together, then they just make this really difficult set of circumstances to move forward from. So you asked, how do I see things working out? So again, I say the truth is I don't know, because something has to give. That's the point. You just wonder where that's going to come from first. Who blinks first?
Yeah.
So we'll soon find out, I'm sure.
Yeah, I really do get the feeling it's going to be the British government who are going to have to cave, because they've caved on a lot of things so far, and so that you see if you'd gone a year ago to most of the Conservative Party and said, "Yep, we're going to be paying 50 billion to the EU,"
yeah,
I don't think they would have accepted it. I really don't. And they've had to. They've I think the reality is started to bite a little bit in terms of what hard Brexit means. And
yeah,
the DUP position is interesting. I feel their minds may have been swayed in some way by the big money that they were raking in. And I'm just going to put my shameless plug in for the conversation we had with Niall Bakewell from Friends of the Earth about the dark money and why it's so important to find out who was funding the £435,000 for the mainland Britain Brexit campaign, not for in Northern Ireland, on mainland Britain, where they spent all the money in the Metro ad. It's nothing to do with Northern Ireland, which is so that kind of sort of suggests to me that there was some shady money involved with the Brexit campaign. And you mentioned there that the phrase a very simple message that everyone got behind. So the company that 40% of the Leave campaigns spent their money on is this tiny little Canadian marketing company called Aggregate IQ, who run by this guy called Zach Massingham, who used to be listed as a number for the Canadian branch of SCL, who are the parent company of Cambridge Analytica. And I know that sounds like super conspiracy theorist, drawing lines that aren't there. But essentially, Aggregate IQ got 40% of the Leave campaign's money. That's not the Leave.eu money, that's every single different group that were campaigning for Brexit. Of all that money tallied, 40% of it went to this one tiny company that there's very little information on. and they essentially like look at building like voter profiles through like psychographic like modeling, and by like building up a really big picture of how certain words play with people, and they're probably a big part of where that take back control phrase came from that was so effective. So there's so many questions surrounding like what actually went on with like the funding of the campaigns. And I have a very
I definitely can't comment on any of that. I'm definitely not with any knowledge of the help there.
Read our piece that will potentially be out by the time this podcast goes live about the different bits of questions over money surrounding Brexit, because it's all based on the theory that I haven't quite got to like worked out in full yet, but it's basically that there was a lot of offshore money funding the campaign. So most of the intellectual like backing for a hard Brexit comes from the Legatum Institute, which is owned by hedge fund managers who are based in Saudi Arabia. The Constitutional Research Council has like ties to like it's like a South African guy and his brother who own the Legatum Institute.
Right.
The Constitutional Research Council have had like business in the past with members of the Saudi royal family, and I'm not like blaming Saudi Arabia, like this is just where two of the like big groups of people happen to be based. And then there's a lot of times that the DUP, UKIP and Conservatives have voted against tax evasion regulation coming from the EU, and we've had a lot of hits on a piece that we did sort of looking at whether tax evasion regulation was like one of the galvanizing factors for the vote. And I just have this really like sort of not sickening feeling, but like this feeling that there's maybe a lot more offshore money involved in the vote than like we maybe appreciate at this point.
Right.
Like, look at all the papers who backed Brexit, and they're all owned by foreign owners. Like I feel like it was very much pushed on people maybe by like big business who stand to benefit, and sold as a like this taking back control to people who felt sort of disenfranchised and forgotten about by 7 years of like austerity and cuts and you know job losses and no real recovery for like most people from the 2008 crash, and that you know it was offered up as this way to be like change, and people went for it.
Yeah,
I think like there's still a lot to understand about the vote in general.
Oh, definitely.
So least of all, what it means for Northern Ireland and the UK in general. But the last thing I kind of wanted to move on to was the electoral consequences of us having no government in Northern Ireland. Like, do you see Sinn Féin and the DUP sort of losing that stranglehold on power that they've had, that sort of as the two largest parties, as like main unionist and nationalist sides? Do you see that sort of dominance continuing? Do you see like someone else coming forward? Do you think that you know they'll mellow and we'll have government, or do you think they'll be voted out, or you know none of the above? Where do you see things going?
Well, it's interesting you talk about you know whether they'll lose the power that they have, because I mean effectively they don't have any the government power at the moment anyway. You know that's you know the reality. You know, they can talk all they like, but you know, they can't deliver their ultimate goals if they're not in government in the first place. So whether it'll ultimately affect their electoral performance, I mean, it's an interesting one, because that would require not just looking at how people see the DUP and Sinn Féin, for example, how their voters see them, but it's always relative. You know, it's how do like DUP voters see Sinn Féin, how does Sinn Féin voters see the DUP, because usually even if a voter is frustrated with his or her own party, they might be even more frustrated with the You know what I mean? So it's not just that someone's frustration with the party they like is getting higher. It's usually that, you know, they blame the other side more for the lack of progress. So that's not just a Northern Ireland politics thing. I mean, that's like a social identity thing that you can see in any context generally. You know, if there's stalemate between two sides, then generally, you know, people, you know, from one side will blame the other side. You know, it's a human instinct to do. And the other thing then in Northern Ireland is that there would have to be a big challenge from the SDLP, you know, in Sinn Féin's context, and the Ulster Unionists in the DUP's context, or alliance from the middle, you know, to maybe sweep up other frustrated voters. And I mean, if you're one of those parties, it's very hard to carve out something as an alternative, because on the one hand, with voters themselves apparently being so polarised, then there's very little space to compete for votes within, you know, because there's, in an electoral context, there seems to be so little like middle ground at the moment. So the UP, for example, on Irish language, you know, mightn't sound very different from the DUP, and the SDLP maybe on some issues, you know, maybe like a border poll, for example, mightn't sound very different from Sinn Féin, and because they maybe feel that they have to sort of catch up with their position if they're going to try and challenge their position and challenge their dominance. So it's hard to see, I think, how the middle ground can assert itself. And we had an interesting article on Northern Slant from Gareth Brown, and his argument was that for too long the sort of those centre ground parties have been competing on the wrong terms, you know, or they've been competing on the terms of their opponents. So that's leaving them, you know, as small players and really struggling to find their place, because they've been just reacting all the time to the arguments from the DUP or Sinn Féin, rather than, you know, inventing a new space for themselves. It's, you know, maybe more cooperative within the centre. You know, so that's something that we saw a little bit before the last Assembly election, where, you know, there might have been some sort of the start of, you know, UP SDLP alliance, not necessarily pact, but cooperation. But then the election itself sort of appeared to ruin the chances of that, you know, taking hold. So it's interesting, you know, whether that's because they tried, you know, and voters rejected it, or whether it was because of the broader context that people rejected, you know, that kind of approach, whether there is still space for that. So it's unpredictable territory. I mean, I think maybe if there is something that unites everyone, it's that, or at least a decent majority, is that we don't really need or want an election for the immediate future, because it's not necessarily going to be productive for making progress in these divisive issues.
So you'd say we don't need an election anytime soon, that we just need to accept that sort of continually going back to the polls isn't really like changing anything, that we need to look for alternative, you know, ways of dealing with our issues?
No, because I mean, one argument could be, you know, you get the parties that, you know, you vote for, so, you know, you shouldn't be surprised by the results after the election. So I suppose one thing is, and again, if we look at America, for example, where, you know, it's like a constant election cycle. You know, for the House of Representatives, it's every 2 years, and then fundraising's like, you know, always happening anyway. So it's like, it's a permanent election, really. And by having, like, in that case, elections every 2 years, it doesn't really give much time for, you know, meaningful getting on with it and governing, because people are always looking over their shoulder. Which in some ways is good, you know, that, you know, politicians feel accountable to voters and, you know, feel that they have to be responsive somehow. But at the same time, elections and just the theatre of them, the nature of the campaign, it automatically, causes people to fall into certain groups, into different camps. So it's about competition rather than cooperation. And for governing, you do need a significant bit of cooperation whenever you're trying to govern over like everyone with a diverse range of views. So any democracy needs an element of both, really. So it's all about balance. And in a place like Northern Ireland, where there are really deep divisions, we know the past. It's a challenge of trying to be able to have politicians who are somehow representative of people who vote, and at the same time that they have enough space to get on with it and govern, because that's what their job is, as well as like representing specific views. They're supposed to be able to try and resolve those differences, to be able to take decisions. So that's the stalemate that we seem to be in. So again, to plug the Citizens Assembly, taking away the heat from the drama and the stakes in an election as they get raised and raised each time. I think it could help for a bit of breathing space, whereby it's not just about trying to win against the other side, but that it's trying to reach some sort of a constructive decision that everyone might be able to accept.
Well, I think that is a nice note to end things on. It's hopeful. But thanks very much for chatting to me. I really enjoyed some of the stuff you had to say about some really interesting points on the work that you'd done there on direct democracy and some of the sort of those rates of acceptance of like citizens' assemblies and referendums. That was really fascinating, and I hope I hope people enjoyed it as much as I did.
Good, I hope so too.
But yeah,
I can send a graph or two if that would be helpful, rather than just people relying on me trying to describe things. I'm a visual person, so it might be helpful to have a couple of
thanks so much for listening.
Props.
If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to like and subscribe to us on Facebook, below. On Twitter, and you'll find on YouTube, links iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find us there. And don't forget to tell everybody you know about this fantastic podcast and how they should be listening to it as well. Until next time, thanks for listening. But yeah, so anyway, thanks very much for chatting to us.
Thanks very much, Josh.